Good evening. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the School of Business at George Washington University, and I am delighted to welcome all of you here in person, as well as those of you who are online watching this episode in the George Talks Business series. Today's session is hosted in partnership with the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis at the School of Business. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, please allow me to introduce our moderator. Ms. Sharon Oliver is principal at Meany & Oliver Companies, a brokerage, consulting, and investment services firm she co-founded in 2004. Prior to this, Ms. Oliver held a number of executive positions in the real estate industry. Ms. Oliver has received numerous professional association awards and previously served as president of Greater Washington Commercial Association of Realtors, Washington Association of Commercial Real Estate Organizations, and Commercial Real Estate Women. Ms. Oliver is also our alum, and she is the chair of the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis Board. Thank you, Sharon, for serving as moderator today.
Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. David Paul. Mr. Paul has served as President and Chief Operating Officer at JBG Smith since the formation transaction. He has over 25 years of experience in the commercial real estate industry. Now, prior to joining JBG, Mr. Paul worked in commercial and retail real estate development and has been involved in both domestic and international real estate investment. Mr. Paul recently joined the Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis Advisory Board. Thank you for being here today. Please join me in welcoming both Sharon and David. Thank you.
So Dave, we're going to have a discussion about things that have gone on JBG Smith and things in the market in general. So first question, JBG has seen significant changes over the last several years. You've lived through a lot of it. So first and foremost, JBG merged with Vornado Charles E. Smith to become JBG Smith and moved from being a private firm to a public company. Explain what led to the merger and what changes have resulted.
Sure. Well, first off, Sharon, thank you for inviting me here today. It's great to be able to speak to everybody here. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start with a little bit of history on JBG because I think it's important to understand the history of our firm because that sort of led us to the merger with Vornado and Charles E. Smith. JBG has been in the Washington, D.C. market for over 50 years investing in real estate in this market. And in the early 90s, we converted from doing sort of one-off investments to doing fund investments. So that meant we raised funds from foundations, endowments, and high net worth individuals. And between the early 90s and the day we merged, we had raised 9 funds that raised about $3.5 billion solely for investment here in Washington, D.C. We had a relatively unique business plan that we invested only in Washington, D.C., and invested in commercial office buildings, retail, residential, and hotel, which is a little bit different from what a lot of other firms do. Other firms often go into one product type, but across multiple markets. We were one market across multiple product types. And in order to be an effective investor in that regard, we had to build capability in-house to invest in all those different product types. So what that meant is we have in-house experts for retail, residential, commercial, and hotel. And we really built an expertise around each of those asset classes. And we also built an expertise about doing mixed-use development and mixed-use, what we call placemaking, which is really taking those different uses and mixing them together in the same building and mixing them together in the same market. And we thought that's important because one, you needed to have the in-house expertise, but most importantly, it really drove changes in those markets that made the places much better places to be, which meant more tenants want to be there, more residents want to live there, and the asset values ended up being higher in that regard. So it was a very successful business plan that we've executed over many years. We executed that plan in the Shaw Market in Ballpark, 14th Street, and it was quite successful. One of the things we realized as we were in the fund model, though, is that we would often concentrate our investments in certain markets because we thought those were going to be high growth markets. But what we found was, obviously land sites and buildings don't come available every day. It takes a long time to assemble these sites. And I think we had one site, it took us 13 years to assemble before we could actually get it all pulled together, which meant we had to invest our multiple funds into those marketplaces in order to gain enough scale to do some of the things we wanted to do. And what that meant is if we had built one building in an early fund, and then had later funds that were still working. The fund investors, in order to drive liquidity and internal rates of return, which is what they were looking for, we had to sell those buildings. And what we found was our placemaking efforts were increasing the value of the whole market, and our asset values would continue to rise, but the fund model sort of dictated, in many cases, that we needed to sell assets, maybe before we would want to and harvest that value over a long period of time. So as a firm, we really began to think about what are some permanent capital sources that we might be able to access that would allow us to hold many of our assets much longer term. So we began to explore some of those options, and the one that kept coming up to the top was obviously a public offering of some sort, whether it was an actual public offering or a merger with another public firm. So while that was going on over here at JBG, Vornado was going through their own process, and Vornado is a large real estate investment trust based out of New York, and they have significant holdings in Manhattan, but they also had a couple divisions that they had decided weren't necessarily core to their strategy. And one was a retail strip center business that they ended up spinning off, and the other was a large division here in Washington, D.C. that was called Vornado Charles E. Smith. And so they decided that they were going to spin off the Vornado Charles E. Smith division in Washington, D.C. And the only question they had to decide was, do they spin it off on its own, or do they merge it in with a local operator? So one of the big assets that they owned in that Vornado Charles E. Smith portfolio was an asset called Crystal City, which we now call National Landing because it's a little bigger. But it was Crystal City, and in its heyday, Crystal City was a tremendous asset. 95% leased on average. It was a sort of a government enclave, a lot of government tenants, a lot of defense contractors. You would remember that well. And it always performed very well. But it had had a downturn really in 2011 when the Base Realignment and Closure Commission required that many government tenants and government contractors relocate out of commercial buildings into government-owned buildings, which really hit Crystal City especially hard. So I think at one point the vacancy rate was well over 30% in Crystal City. They had been able to climb back over several years to get the vacancy rate to somewhere between 20 and 25%, but there were certain mothballed buildings, they had lots of vacant land, and as a result, it was really, in some respects, a depressed portfolio. A lot of brokers in the market, I'd be interested in your perspective, but a lot of brokers in the market would say, several years ago, the best days of Crystal City have passed it by. It's never going to come back.
We thought they were long gone.
Yes.
And Arlington, of course, was used to a 2% vacancy rate, not a 30% vacancy rate either.
That's right.
So
the market thought, the best days have passed this asset. We looked at it and said, we think this is a diamond in the rough. It had great access to transportation, right next to the Pentagon, between the Pentagon and Reagan National Airport, had great access to downtown DC, had direct metro access, had a Virginia Rail Express station on site, had 50,000 people there during the day, about 10,000 people there at night. But what we thought it needed was some placemaking, really trying to apply some of the placemaking skills we had applied in other markets, apply that to National Landing in Crystal City. We thought we could really turn that around and reinvigorate the asset. So after a long period of time, we did a lot of haggling with Vornado, as you can imagine, about valuation between our two portfolios, but ultimately structured a transaction in which Vornado spun off their Washington, D.C. division as a public company. And then we subsequently merged JBG, the operating company, and a series of our assets from our funds into that new public company to become JBG Smith, the publicly traded company. Today, JBG Smith is probably the largest and most active operator in Washington, D.C. with about 11 million square feet of office space, about 4,500 residential units. We have 8 assets under construction today, about half are multifamily, half are office, and about 18 million square feet of future development capacity that we think is really going to be a tremendous growth pipeline going forward for the company. Well,
certainly JBG is on the trajectory of moving up in the world here, and that kind of leads to the next question and the next discussion point, which is that JBG Smith won the award of the largest private sector deal ever done in the DC metropolitan area with the commitment of Amazon to lease or build up to about 4.5 million square feet in Crystal City, now known as National Landing. The deal changed the entire landscape of Arlington, changed the landscape of Alexandria, and probably the greater Washington metropolitan area, with a tech company coming here and making that kind of commitment to Washington, D.C., which had never been done before. So most often price and location are the driving factors in a real estate deal. Things were different in this deal. What factors really set JBG Smith's offer apart, and what was Amazon looking for that made them decide to locate in Crystal City, now National Landing?
Yeah, It's a great question. What's interesting is we closed the merger with Vornado on July 7th of 2017, and Amazon announced their headquarters search on September 7th of 2017. So sometimes
let's go.
Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, I think. But obviously, as soon as that got announced, we really assembled a big team to have all hands on deck to see how we could try to be a part of that race. I think one of the things that's important about that whole search is it wasn't just a JBG Smith effort. I mean, the county, Arlington County, the Commonwealth of Virginia were critical partners in landing Amazon. And in fact, the RFP that went out from Amazon originally went to the state. And the state and the county were responsible for really organizing all the various real estate opportunities and options available to Amazon as part of that process. So we were one of multiple options that went into that process. I think when we think back about what the key factors were in Amazon selecting National Landing, I think we come up with really 5 factors. First and foremost, Amazon was really focused on, did this market have the tech talent that it needed to continue to grow and meet its hiring needs? Amazon has made to the state and the county that they're going to hire between 25,000 and 38,000 employees over the next 10 years in National Landing. That's a tremendous supply of people that you need to satisfy those jobs. So having the depth of talent in the market was critically important. A couple interesting facts about the DC market that we uncovered as we were going through this pursuit. DC has the 3rd largest tech employee base of any market in the country, which is surprising to a lot of people because they think of San Francisco and Seattle and all the consumer-oriented tech companies. Really, that's what everyone thinks of. Here, I think it's a little quieter. We have a lot of defense contractors, we have a lot of cybersecurity firms, we have a lot of government agencies that have a tremendous tech talent base of employees in their agencies. This region generates one of the highest levels of tech graduates in the country, and it has the highest level of those tech graduates leaving the market for other places. Because the steady growth that a lot of those consumer-oriented tech platforms have provided, a lot of those tech graduates leave. And I think Amazon looked at that and said, this is a market that has an existing great talent base and a talent base that's already in the pipeline that ends up leaving that we could tap into to help meet our needs there. So that was first and foremost a deep talent pool. The second was really focused on quality of life for their employees. Did we have great cultural institutions? Do we have great schools? And schools was sort of a two-edged sword on the schools. One was great schools for their employees, kids, but also great schools that over time would continue to create a great pipeline of technically educated employees that could then feed their needs. And believe it or not, the DC region actually ranked pretty low, what I'll say, on the housing affordability index. In other words, we actually rate our relative cost of living as low relative to other gateway markets. So they saw that as a positive. That was the second factor. Third factor was the real estate deal, and that didn't come till pretty late in the process. But the things that were such a negative about Crystal City originally, which was we had a lot of we had mothballed buildings, and we had a lot of vacant land, became assets in the Amazon search. Having vacant buildings that Amazon could go into, having mothballed buildings that could get turned back on for Amazon, and having land that Amazon could acquire to build their headquarters became great assets. And because Amazon really wanted to try to find a landowner who could accommodate their entire growth requirement, who could meet it all on site, because then they'd only have to make one deal versus having to make multiple deals. And we demonstrated to them that we could satisfy the entire growth requirement that they would have over a 10 or 15 or 20 year period. And I think that gave them a lot of confidence and comfort. The fourth thing I think that was critical was the subsidy package that the state and the county put together. It was, I think, the most unique and creative package clearly of the whole Amazon process. And we've heard it's one of the most unique and creative subsidy packages really on any sort of large corporate headquarters relocation. The state and the county focused their subsidy package about $1 billion on infrastructure and about another $1 billion on education, so investing back in the community. And that infrastructure included some interesting things like taking Route 1 road in National Landing down to grade to make it more pedestrian friendly, creating a pedestrian bridge from National Landing over to the airport that people could literally walk to the airport from all of National Landing. It's interesting, a New York City block is about 900 feet long. The pedestrian bridge will be about 700 feet long. So I think it's one of the closest airports to a downtown area, maybe other than Toronto, that will be in the country. So that's sort of interesting, adding some metro stations. And then the second section I think that was really critical was investment in education. And so really the state of Virginia created a tech campus in conjunction with Virginia Tech about a mile south of where Amazon is going to land. And the idea is to graduate about 750 technically trained graduate students every single year that can, again, be a continuous pipeline of technically trained employees for Amazon and any other companies in this region that need that sort of qualification. And I think Amazon got very excited about the technology ecosystem that could be created here with Virginia Tech on the south, with them on the north, with a lot of area in between to really fill in with other companies as well.
And you see that reaching farther now too into other universities and even down into the elementary schools in Alexandria and Arlington, where STEM has become really the method of education for all of this now, and the focus is shifting quickly.
Yeah,
I think that's right. all the schools.
I think that's right. I think the last point I would say is that Amazon really bought into the vision that we had for National Landing. Again, it was a tired asset that needed some revitalization, as you well know. And they really understood the plan. We were going to triple the amount of retail on the main street. We're going to add a lot of residential to make it a more 18 to 24-hour urban environment, much like downtown DC. And they really bought into that vision. And I think it reminded them of South Lake Union in Seattle, which is where they have obviously a large presence. Before they got there, that was really an old industrial area that was really not very exciting. It's now probably the most exciting area in downtown Seattle. And I think they saw the opportunity to do the same thing here in National Landing.
One of the things you all did really well was allow them to visualize it. The Marketing Center really demonstrated what Crystal City could become. And when you walked through that, you really felt like you were in a different place, that it wasn't the old Crystal City, it was the new National Landing. So kudos to you, because I think demonstrating that can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
But speaking of Crystal City, as Crystal City, recently you announced plans that for surrounding buildings that are not part of Amazon but are part of future development, and you submitted plans to Arlington County to develop about 2.6 million square feet of additional space there. So could you address that a little bit and what you see happening with everybody in Crystal City and the buildings in Crystal City that are not being taken by Amazon?
Sure. Absolutely. So what Amazon is doing, Amazon is going to acquire 2 pieces of land from us. We're going to build for them a 4.1 million square foot headquarters campus where they're going to house their initial 25,000 employees. They've leased 600,000 square feet of existing space in some of those older buildings that I was speaking about. They're going to go into old sort of mothballed buildings and a couple of existing buildings as well. And they're taking occupancy of those buildings as we speak. So that's happening right away. Yeah, we have some big plans, and it's really an extension of the vision. What we've done is we've really accelerated our vision that we already had for National Landing. With Amazon showing up, we're really pushing forward to try to accelerate it. And I'd say it has a couple key components. One is tripling the amount of retail on Crystal Drive to really create a much deeper amenity base there for retail that I think a lot of both residents and office occupants want to see there. And so that's in process. Significantly increasing the amount of residential in the market, again, to make it an 18 to 24-hour community. We're going to add between, over some period of time, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 residential units into that marketplace directly in National Landing, because again, we think that will add more demand for retail and it will be a much better and more interesting place to live. We have a couple of office sites that we have sort of allocated towards other corporate users if another corporation wants to relocate, if a new technology tenant comes in, if Amazon needs expansion space, really looking at what we can provide them, and that's being designed and prepared, and then we'll go out and see if we can find any users for that. And then really creating some tremendous open space and much more activated space in National Landing. We have a lot of open space today, but it hasn't traditionally been activated, and figuring out ways to activate it and make it a much more interesting place. What's interesting is a lot of the existing tenants that are there today had the same question you have. What's going to happen to us now?
Right.
Is everyone focused on Amazon? And our response to that is absolutely not. We still have a lot of government tenants there. We have a lot of associations. And we have a lot of those tenants were in the process of doing renewals when the Amazon transaction was going on. And we've renewed every single one of them in place because they're such a fundamental, important part of that whole market that we have there.
We've certainly created quite a market there. Looking to other markets in the DC area, you're active all around, not just in Crystal City and not just with Amazon. Take the Ballpark as an example, where you have built a fair amount of residential, and you can see it today from the ballpark. There's places like that that you've really helped change and make be different than what they were before today. Can you address some of those areas, maybe the ballpark, Shaw, some of the places that growing up in Washington, we would have never gone. You would have never even ventured to those areas, and they really are places today.
Right. Yeah, so we do a tremendous amount of research on which markets we want to invest in, and we picked out what we thought were some key high growth, what we call emerging growth markets. It does include the ballpark, it does include Shaw, 14th Street. We have a lot of land we control in the Union Market area that we think is growing now. It's going to continue to grow. When you're watching the World Series, if you look out in left field and you see the building with all the red lit up in the top, that's our apartment building that looks right into the stadium. So that's very exciting. What we have found is those markets are really the places where a lot of young people moving into the city want to live. They're exciting. They have a lot of retail. We have retail in the base of all these buildings. They're exciting places to live. They're close to mass transit. They're close to the jobs that the individuals want to take, and they're relatively reasonably priced relative to maybe living in downtown. So we find that those are the markets that we really want to invest in, and they're performing quite well.
Which sort of leads to one of the issues that we really have here in Washington, which is affordable housing. And you all have tried to begin to address that in a pretty major way with the formation of the Washington Housing Initiative with the Federal City Council. How do you expect that to unfold? How do you see affordable housing getting solved by what you all have set up?
Yeah.
Because it's a pretty major problem. It's not something that can be easily done overnight.
It's a great question. I think every major city struggles with this issue, especially as more higher paid employees come in. It tends to take out what is traditional affordable housing for new housing. And so it's a big issue in every city in the country. We began thinking about this several years ago, well before Amazon ever announced their headquarters search, and began to think about what's a structure we could put together that is scalable, could be done quickly, is not government-based, because we didn't think that the government could move quickly enough or scale enough, and could be replicable as a way to solve this. So we spent a lot of time thinking about different structures. And we realized that one of the things that we really needed to do was bring down the cost of capital. That if we're going to bring private capital to try to solve this problem, we have to bring down the cost of that capital so that we can keep the assets affordable. So we set up what was called the Washington Housing Initiative that has two components. One is the Washington Housing Conservancy, which is a nonprofit entity that will own the affordable housing long term and ultimately be a self-sustaining nonprofit that could hold that affordable housing long term. So we start to create that. On the opposite side, we created what was called the impact pool. And the impact pool is an investment vehicle that will help drive down the cost of capital. So if for example, we were buying a building for $1,000, which you can't buy a building for $1,000, but if we were, the senior debt would be somewhere between 65 and 75% of that $1,000. The Washington Housing Conservancy would put in about 5% of the equity, so a relatively small amount of equity. And the impact pool would provide the remainder of the capital between that 65 and 75% debt and then 95%. And the key there is that it's a capped return that is being charged on that mezzanine financing. It's a 7% capped return. And when we've looked at that capital structure relative to private operators, what we found is we have a cost of capital reduction by about 25 or 30%, which really allows us to be, one, competitive in acquiring existing assets and leaving them affordable, or building new assets and making them affordable. And it allows us to then compete and create that program at scale. The next question was, could you raise money in that impact pool? Could we find investors that wanted to do that? And the answer is we've been very successful so far at doing that. It took a long time to figure out the right structure and the right organizational elements to do that, but basically what we found was JBG Smith is going to put in a very small amount, less than 10% of the capital in that vehicle. But then we've been able to get a lot of banks interested in investing in that because it satisfies their need for what are called Community Reinvestment Act credits. Creating affordable housing does that, and this allows them to do that at scale. So we've raised about $80 million to the impact pool so far. We think in the next several months we'll probably be well over $100 million. And we have a team in place now run by A.J. Jackson, who's out actively looking for assets today to acquire and land sites to acquire to develop and create affordable housing in and around the DC area. We have a number of assets that we're targeting to hopefully close relatively soon. And so it's just getting going, but we think we're trying to really prove out that we think this is a problem that can be at least somewhat addressed by a private market solution. And we hope to prove that, make it replicable, and hopefully other cities can basically replicate the same thing to try to address it.
It sounds like you're doing an amazing job with that, and we certainly need a lot of help in that area. And if we have some kind of model that works for everybody, all the better.
Exactly, that's the way we feel.
So, JBG Smith is involved in all facets of the real estate market. With an election year ahead, with the potential for a recession, what areas of real estate do you see coming out on top, if you will?
Well, we're not making any election predictions, and
No, we're not talking politics here. We're just talking real estate.
and we try to, we obviously we try to invest in a way that is it's sort of agnostic as to who actually is in office, because it can obviously change, and we've invested through multiple groups. Obviously, there may be a recession at some point. There will be a recession at some point. It may be in 10 months or 10 years. Who knows? There will be a recession at some point. So what we have tried to focus on are what are those markets that we think have really durable and lasting fundamental demand drivers, and those are the markets we want to invest in. Obviously, we're pretty excited about National Landing, if you can't take that away from what I'm saying. And we think that even during a recession period should continue to perform pretty well, and there should be an underlying demand driver there that we think is very exciting. We also think investing in some of that multifamily in some of those urban core markets is we think, going to be a healthy market over a long term. There may be a downturn, in which case you take a little bit of a hit, but we think those are, relative to other markets and availabilities, we think those are going to be very healthy markets. Again, we're trying to focus our investments on urban cores that have metro access as well as great amenities, or amenities areas that we can create amenities, and those are the markets we think are going to perform the best. One area that we are not as bullish on is downtown DC office space. Last year we sold about $1 billion worth of assets. Most of those were in downtown Washington, DC. And it's because when we look at the supply-demand dynamics in that marketplace, there's a lot of supply, there's not as much demand, which means your cost of backfilling tenant spaces are high. And so when we put several assets on the marketplace, and what we found was that buyers were willing to pay pretty good prices for those assets at return levels that we thought were not very high. And we decided then to take that capital, sell those assets, and recycle it back into some of our higher yielding development opportunities. So we'll probably continue to do that as long as the market's there for that.
And how do you feel about the suburban markets here?
Again, certain key suburban markets, we really like Reston, Bethesda, we like those, again, because they're sort of urban cores where all the employees want to be, and which means all the employers want to be there long term. So we feel good about those. We keep a very close eye on the supply-demand and dynamics in each of those markets, but we feel good about the fundamentals in each of those markets.
So what would you recommend students focus on to pursue a successful career in commercial real estate?
It's a question we get a lot, and I think I'd say a couple things. First, I would, when trying to think about selecting a firm to work for, I would really focus on where am I going to learn the most? Where am I going to get the most exposure to some of the most interesting elements of real estate, whether that's development, investments, asset management, property management, financing. Try to join a firm that you get a very wide range of experience. Second is try to join a firm where you can try to identify a mentor or several mentors, because that's so critical to helping one, get a champion internally at a firm, but also to help really provide some professional advice as you go along. And I think the third area that's so important is culture of the firm. And you and I have spoken about this in the past.
Quite a bit.
You spend 8 to 12 hours a day with these people, a lot longer than you spend with your family, so you better like them. And so culture is really critical, I think, to that. And so really try to focus on working with people that you really like and get along with.
And they'll open avenues for you later on in your career, too.
That's right.
So thank you, David. I'd like to also thank all of you who joined us in person and online, and invite you to the next session in the George Talks Business Series. George Talks will continue next Tuesday. Our guest will be Tom Cortese, co-founder, chief operating officer, and head of products at Peloton. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you then.